In the summer of 1817, a group of men stood in a field near Rome, New York, holding shovels, staring at an empty stretch of dirt that stretched toward the horizon. There was no machinery. There were no trained engineers. There was, by most expert opinion of the era, no reasonable chance that what they were about to attempt would ever work. And yet, by the time they put those shovels down 8 years later, they had carved a 363-mile ribbon of water across the entire state of New York, by hand, and in doing so, they had rewired the economic destiny of a young nation. This is the story of the Erie Canal and the ordinary people who dug a nation's future out of the mud. To understand why anyone would attempt something this audacious, you have to go back to the man who refused to let the idea die. DeWitt Clinton was the mayor of New York City and later its governor, and he had become obsessed with a simple but staggering proposition: what if you could connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean with a man-made waterway? At the time, moving goods overland from the Midwest to the East Coast was brutally slow and brutally expensive. Wagons crawled over rutted dirt roads. A single ton of freight could cost more than $100 to haul the distance, and that same ton could take 3 weeks to arrive, if the weather cooperated and the wagon didn't break an axle somewhere in the wilderness. Clinton believed a canal could change all of that. Almost no one else did. The skepticism wasn't just casual doubt, it was open mockery. Newspapers and rival politicians started calling the project Clinton's Big Ditch and Clinton's Folly, gleefully predicting it would bankrupt the state and go nowhere, literally. Even Thomas Jefferson, a man not exactly known for lacking vision, thought the whole thing was lunacy. His reasoning wasn't unfair, either. The United States, at that point, did not have a single trained civil engineer. Not one. Britain had them. Europe had them. America had farmers, surveyors, and self-taught tinkerers, and Jefferson simply could not imagine that kind of amateur workforce pulling off an engineering feat that would rival anything being built on the other side of the Atlantic. He reportedly said it was 100 years ahead of its time. He wasn't entirely wrong about the difficulty. He was just wrong about what determined, resourceful people are capable of when they have no other choice but to figure it out as they go. And figure it out, they did. On July 4, 1817, Independence Day, construction officially began in Rome, New York. Now, if you're picturing the crew starting at one end and working their way across the state, that's not what happened, and the reason why tells you everything about the strategic thinking behind this project. The planners chose to start in the middle, on the flattest, easiest section of the entire route. Why start with the easy part? Because they needed proof of concept, and they needed it fast. If they could get a functioning stretch of canal open quickly, they could start collecting toll revenue almost immediately, revenue that would help fund the harder sections still to come. Just as importantly, that first stretch became a training ground. The men who dug it, who had never built a canal in their lives, were learning the trade in real time, developing techniques and instincts they would carry forward into the far more punishing terrain that awaited them to the west. Because make no mistake, most of the men swinging those shovels were not professional laborers in any formal sense. They were local farmers looking to earn cash during the months between planting and harvest. They were recent Irish immigrants, arriving in America with little more than the clothes on their backs and a willingness to do back-breaking work for a wage. Over the 8 years of construction, an estimated 50,000 men would pass through the canal's workforce at one point or another. The pay was modest, somewhere around 50 cents a day, but it typically came with room, board, and, in a detail that tells you a lot about the era, a daily ration of whiskey. Whether that whiskey ration made the work more bearable or the work more dangerous is a question historians still enjoy debating, but at the time, it was simply considered a standard part of doing business with a shovel crew. Now, digging a ditch is one thing. Digging a ditch through dense forest, packed with centuries-old tree stumps, is another problem entirely. In the early going, workers were lucky if they could clear a handful of stumps in a single day, hacking and prying at root systems that had been anchored in the earth for generations. At that pace, the math simply didn't work. The canal would have taken decades. So a local contractor put his mind to the problem and came up with a solution that feels almost comically simple in hindsight and brilliantly effective in practice. He built a massive wheel, 16 feet across, rigged with cables and gearing, and hitched it to a team of oxen. As the oxen walked in a circle, the wheel turned, and the mechanical advantage generated by that rotation was enough to rip stumps clean out of the ground, roots and all. What had been a few stumps a day suddenly became up to 40 stumps a day. It was a crude machine by any modern standard, but it was exactly the kind of frontier ingenuity that would define the entire project. When the textbooks didn't exist, the workers wrote their own. A similar breakthrough happened with the mortar itself. The canal needed 83 stone locks along its route, chambers that would raise and lower boats as the elevation changed across the state, and every one of those locks needed a bond strong enough to hold back tons of water without crumbling. Standard mortar simply wouldn't do the job. It would dissolve and fail when constantly submerged. An engineer on the project named Canvas White went looking for a solution and found it practically underfoot, discovering a type of limestone in Madison County, New York, that could be processed into a natural hydraulic cement, a mortar that actually hardened and strengthened when exposed to water instead of breaking down. It meant the builders no longer had to import expensive cement from Europe. They could quarry, process, and produce everything they needed locally, right along the canal route. It was a discovery that saved enormous amounts of time and money, and it's one of those quiet engineering victories that rarely gets remembered, even though it made the entire lock system possible. Of course, not every obstacle had such a clean solution. Some sections of the route seemed determined to make the workers pay in blood, sweat, and fever. When construction reached the Montezuma Marshes in the summer of 1819, crews found themselves wading into a landscape of knee-deep mud and stagnant, standing water, digging through wetland that had no business being turned into a shipping canal. The mosquitoes were relentless. Within weeks, hundreds of laborers had come down with malaria, which at the time was simply known as swamp fever, since nobody yet understood that mosquitoes were the ones spreading it. Men worked through fevers and chills because there was no other option, no safety net, no workers' compensation, just the job in front of them and the wage waiting at the end of the week. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. These weren't soldiers following orders in a war. These were civilians, farmers and immigrants, choosing to stand in disease-ridden swamp water because it was the best economic opportunity available to them at the time. If the marshes tested human endurance, the Niagara Escarpment tested raw engineering nerve. Near the town of Lockport, the canal's route ran straight into a wall of solid limestone, a natural rock formation that rose sharply and simply would not yield to a shovel. There was no digging through this. The only way forward was to blast through it, and the crew spent grueling months hand-drilling holes into the rock face and packing them with black powder, section by section, explosion by explosion, cutting a channel nearly 2 miles long through solid stone. But blasting a path through the rock only solved half the problem, because Lockport also sat at one of the steepest elevation changes along the entire canal route. Boats needed to climb 60 feet in a short distance, and the engineers responded by designing what became known as the Flight of Five, a staircase of 5 double locks, stacked one after another, lifting vessels up the escarpment one chamber at a time like a water-powered elevator built entirely from stone and timber. It remains one of the single most impressive feats of the entire project, a place where you can still stand today and feel the sheer physical audacity of what those crews accomplished with hand tools and black powder. After 8 years, 83 locks, countless stumps, and untold gallons of whiskey, the impossible finally happened. On October 26, 1825, the Erie Canal officially opened, stretching the full 363 miles from Buffalo on Lake Erie all the way to Albany, where it connected to the Hudson River and, from there, straight down to New York City in the open Atlantic. Governor DeWitt Clinton, the man once mocked for his ditch, boarded a boat in Buffalo and rode the entire length of the canal in a procession, greeted by cheering crowds and cannon fire relayed mile by mile all the way to Manhattan. When he finally reached New York Harbor, Clinton performed a ceremony that history would remember as the Wedding of the Waters, pouring 2 casks of water drawn from Lake Erie directly into the Atlantic Ocean, a symbolic union of the western frontier and the eastern seaboard, sealed in front of a crowd that understood they were watching something genuinely historic. And the economic impact was every bit as dramatic as the ceremony suggested it might be. Before the canal, shipping a ton of freight from Buffalo to New York City could cost well over $100 and take nearly 3 weeks. Almost overnight, that same ton could move for under $10, and the trip that once took weeks now took roughly 8 days. Grain, lumber, and goods from the Midwest could suddenly reach the Atlantic markets faster and cheaper than anyone had thought possible, and New York City, sitting right at the canal's eastern doorway, transformed almost instantly into the busiest, wealthiest port in the entire country, eclipsing rivals like Philadelphia and Baltimore for good. Towns that had barely existed along the canal's route, places like Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo itself, exploded into thriving commercial cities practically overnight, built on the trade that now flowed steadily past their doorsteps. What's remarkable, looking back, is that none of this was inevitable. It was built by 50,000 men who had no formal training for the job, using tools they invented as problems appeared in front of them, surviving swamp fever and rock blasts and sheer physical exhaustion because a stubborn mayor from New York City refused to accept that America couldn't do something simply because it had never been done before. Thomas Jefferson thought it was 100 years too early. It turned out to be exactly on time, and it changed the shape of American commerce for generations to come. The next time you look at a map of New York State and see that long, deliberate line of water cutting across it, remember, it isn't just a canal. It's a monument to the kind of stubborn, hands-on ingenuity that built a country one shovelful of dirt at a time.